Computer Science 461, Somerville, Chapter 14, Security Engineering. And this is Somerville's chapter on security. It presents a very high-level overview of the area. There are now entire classes and programs on the subject. UH-ELO offers a security course from time to time. That's CS 435. It's an infrequent offering, but if you're interested in the topic, you can encourage the faculty and staff to offer it and take it. So, basically as motivation, the Internet and networked applications have increased our need for security. And in fact, the Internet of Things, where almost everything is connected to the Internet, will further increase our need for security. Now, we still hack stuff back in the 70s and 80s, as evidenced by the picture from War Games, but it's not to the degree that happens now, and certainly wasn't reported as much. So, hence the designing systems that incorporate security is of vital importance, because it's becoming more and more of an issue as more and more things are connected. So, security engineering is concerned with how to develop and maintain systems that can resist malicious attacks intended to damage a computer-based system or its data. Somerville, again, wants this chapter to serve as an introduction to concepts for software engineering students rather than as an entire course in security, which I agree with. So, a couple things to consider. One, you need to consider the application software and the infrastructure on which it is built. Now, different areas in the organization take responsibility for each type of security. So, the systems management group will take responsibility for the infrastructure, and the software engineering group will take responsibility for the application security. So, talk a few minutes about security management, even though this is not the area we're interested in. What do they do? One, they do user and permission management, system software deployment, system software maintenance and configuration, and attack monitoring. So things like our Computer Science APT does, or ITS for the overall University of Hawaii. And this is an interesting job, and it does make for an interesting course, but this is not what we're focused on in terms of software engineering. So, take a look at a few security concepts. Terms, asset, this is a system resource that has some value and needs to be protected. An exposure is possible loss or harm that could result from a successful attack. Vulnerability is a weakness in a computer system that may be exploited to cause loss or harm. And an attack is an exploitation of the system's vulnerability. Threats are circumstances that have the potential to cause loss or harm, but may not be realized, and a control is a protective measure that reduces the system's vulnerability. So, three categories of threat. One of these is threats to confidentiality. Some examples of these are Oxford versus Moss and R.V. Stewart. So Oxford versus Moss is a really interesting case, and basically the defendant here was Moss, and he was a university student, and he managed to obtain a proof copy of his forthcoming exam paper. It was accepted they always intended to return the proof to the faculty member that he took it from, and therefore he couldn't be convicted of theft of the proof itself. However, he was still charged with stealing information belonging to the Senate of the university. However, the court ruled that information could not be deemed intangible property and therefore was incapable of being stolen with the Theft Act in 1968. Likewise, R.V. Stewart, which was a union organizer who was obtaining a database of employees and was charged with theft, the Supreme Court of Canada held that the confidential information is not property, which may be the subject matter of theft under Section 322 of the Canadian Criminal Code. By the way, here R stands for Regina or Rex, which are Latin words for king or queen, basically U.S. equivalent of the state. The Sony Pictures hack in 2014 is a more recent example of loss of confidentiality. Of course, you can now be charged with other things if you steal information, so you're not going to be as lucky as Moss or Stewart. In terms of threats to data integrity, these are usually hacks that change the financial information of an organization. I'm sure everyone is familiar with at least one denial of service attack. An example of that was Sony's PlayStation being caught in a denial of service attack on numerous occasions. So Sony certainly has problems with this. So how do you control things? Well, there are three types of controls. One is controls to ensure the attacks are unsuccessful. For example, non-public networks. If it's not connected to the internet, it's a little more difficult to break into. Encryption basically can prevent people from getting into your data or from decoding what your data actually says. Controls to detect and repel attacks, monitoring operation of the system and repelling attacks, and recovery controls, logging of the system activities to return to a previous state so that things aren't corrupted. Security risk management, no metal parts on these Legos, so I don't think that alarm will go off. So, risk management is concerned with assessing possible losses that might ensue from attacks on the system and balancing those losses against the cost of security procedures that may reduce these losses. So in other words, if the cost of the security is more than loss, then probably don't want to implement the security. So another term is security by obscurity. So risk management should probably be driven by an organizational security policy and involves preliminary risk assessment that occurs before design and lifecycle risk assessment that occurs during the design. Let's take a look at both of these. So again, the preliminary risk assessment occurs before the design, and you need to look at the whole system and not just the software. So there are 8 stages: asset identification, value assessment, exposure assessment, there's threat identification, probability of that threat occurring, and control identification and feasibility of implementing those controls. And all this information will go into a security requirements document. So the life cycle is after you've developed the software. And basically after you've developed the design. The key difference here is the preliminary design is available for you to assess in terms of security risks. And basically you need to be thinking about security risks during each phase of the software development lifecycle. So there are different vulnerabilities associated with each different type of technology choice. One, if you choose a login password authentication, users can set guessable passwords. The number one most guessed password is password, followed by 1 2 3 4 5 6. The ever so tricky 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. ABC 1 2 3. QWERTY. Monkey. Let me in. Dragon. 1 1 1 1 1 1. Baseball. Should always be thinking about baseball. I love you. Trust no one. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. Sunshine, Master, 1 2 3 1 2 3, Welcome, Shadow, Ashley, Football, Jesus, Michael, Ninja, Mustang, and Password 1. Even if you do set a good password, or a user does set a good password, sometimes they'll reveal it to unauthorized users. Client-server architecture can also have problems such as denial of the service attacks, and there may be confidential information left in the browser cache, and there can be security loopholes in browsers themselves and that lead to unauthorized access, or in the platforms that you're using to build your web-based architecture. And the same thing with web editable forms. Basically, you can have certain injections that take place that cause the system to crash. So design for security is important, and security is an emergent property. You don't really get the whole picture on security until you have the whole system in place. That doesn't mean you can't design for it, but you can't have the entire picture until the system comes together. So what are some good things to do in architectural design, good practices for security, and how do you design for deployment? So architectural design, you can design for protection. How should the system be organized so that critical assets can be protected against an external attack? And distribution, how should the assets be distributed so the effect of a successful attack are minimized? Now these are potentially conflicting. If the assets are distributed, then they're more expensive to protect. The Also, the amount of security that people will tolerate is contextual. Certainly, you would tolerate more security in the Honolulu airport. You'll go through the TSA line. You may be checked at the gates than you would at Liliuokalani Gardens. Certainly, you wouldn't want to go through the TSA in order to walk around Liliuokalani Gardens here in Hilo. So, security, again, is contextual, and if there's far too much security, then people are remiss to use the system. So 10 basic security guidelines. Base them on explicit security policy that your organization has in place. Avoid a single point of failure. Have some type of fallback procedure in case you do fail or in case you are hacked. Balance security and usability. Basically, at some point it will get too annoying in terms of the amount of hoops somebody has to jump through to use the system, and they'll just stop using the system. Be aware of possibilities of social engineering. Now, this is what Kevin Mitnick did so very well, but these are hard to counteract. Use redundancy and diversity to reduce risk. Validate all inputs. For example, protect against buffer overflow. Little interesting factoid. Somerville says no name is longer than 70 characters, but I think you can probably pick up a University of Hawaii graduation program and find some that are. Validate against SQL poisoning. Don't let people do SQL injections into your web forms. Compartmentalize your assets. Design for deployment and design for recovery. So design for deployment basically is understand the environment in which you are implementing your system. Include support for viewing and analyzing configurations. Minimize the default privileges and minimize the default settings. So a good example of default username and password are admin and password. You don't want to necessarily deploy it with that username and password combination. Provide easy ways to fix the security vulnerabilities if you can do that. And then last but not least, system survivability. You want your system to have survivability, and you may remember survivability from the emergent properties that we discussed back at the beginning of CS460. So the essence of survivability is availability. So which services are most essential, how these services might be compromised, what minimal level of service do you want to be maintained, how to protect these services, and how to recover quickly. So one of the major researchers in this area is a guy by the name of Ellison. He has 3 principles. One is resistance, repel attacks, for example, using digital certificates. Recognition, detect problems, for example, using checksums. And recovery, for example, incorporating fault tolerance into your system design. So 4 stages in survivability analysis: review the system and architecture, identify the critical services and components, identify attacks and compromisable components, and identify soft spots and survivability strategies for the system. So for system understanding, you want to review the goals, requirements, and architecture, identify the critical services. These are the ones that you have to maintain regardless. Attack simulation is a key activity. Devise attack scenarios and identify the components affected by those attack scenarios and how you can defeat those attack scenarios. And then survivability analysis. Identify the survivability strategies to be applied. So here's an example. An attack, an unauthorized user places malicious orders. Required dealing password to place orders that is different from the login password. And recognition is send a copy of the order by email to the authorized user with contact phone number so they can detect malicious orders. And then for recovery, provide a mechanism to automatically undo trades and restore user accounts. Refund users for losses that are due to malicious trading and ensure against consequential losses. Same thing for corruption transactions on database. You would indicate some form of resistance, how you recognize it, and how you recover. Next time we'll take a look at socio-technical systems.